The Last Trail, Part 5. On the sixth morning, Sarah did not get up. Arjun woke with the first gray light and saw her lying on the emergency blanket, curled up in a tight ball. Her face was as white as the snow around them. Her breathing was shallow and fast. When he touched her forehead, it was burning hot. Fever. Sarah, wake up. He shook her gently. She opened her eyes, but they were glassy and unfocused. Arjun? Her voice was barely a whisper. We need to move. We have to keep going. She tried to sit up and fell back down. My arm, she said. Something's wrong. I can feel it spreading. Arjun carefully pulled back the sling and looked at her arm. His stomach dropped. The purple swelling had spread past her elbow now, and there were red lines running up toward her shoulder. He did not know much about medicine, but he knew that red lines meant infection, the kind that could kill. He looked into her eyes and made a decision. He was not going to let her die out here. I'm going to carry you, he said. Sarah shook her head weakly. You can't. I'm too heavy. You haven't eaten. You'll collapse. Then I'll collapse, but I'm not leaving you here. He helped her onto his back. She was lighter than he expected. Days of no food had taken weight from both of them. She wrapped her good arm around his neck and pressed her face against his shoulder. Arjun picked up the backpack in one hand, took a deep breath, and started walking. The first hour was the hardest thing Arjun had ever done. Harder than the river, harder than the plane crash. His legs burned, his back screamed. Every step sent pain shooting up his spine. He was carrying another human being through snow and rough ground, with an empty stomach and a wounded head. His body was begging him to stop, to put her down, to rest. But he kept walking. He counted steps again, 1 to 500, then again, and again. The trail was clear now. The snow was thinner at this lower level, and he could see the dirt path underneath. The trees were changing too, more birch than pine, with white bark that glowed in the morning sun. The river was wider here, and moving slower. The land was opening up. Sarah drifted in and out of sleep on his back. Sometimes she would mumble words he could not understand. Sometimes she said her father's name. Once she said, "The bears are moving south." Arjun just kept walking, talking to her even when she could not hear him. Stay with me, Sarah. We're going to make it. Just hold on. I can see the valley opening up. We're getting close. I know we are. Just stay with me. Around mid-morning, he saw something that nearly made his knees give out. Not from tiredness, but from joy. A wooden sign, old and leaning to one side, standing at a fork in the trail. The words were faded, but still readable. Denali Station, 4 miles. 4 miles. Just 4 miles. Arjun felt tears burn his eyes. He blinked them away and shifted Sarah's weight on his back. 4 miles. He could do 4 miles. He had already done the impossible. 4 more miles was nothing. But his body disagreed. After another mile, his vision started to blur. Black spots danced in front of his eyes. His legs were shaking so badly that each step felt like walking on rubber. He stumbled and nearly fell. Sarah groaned on his back. He stopped and leaned against a tree, breathing hard. His heart was pounding in a way that felt wrong. Too fast, too uneven. He was running out of fuel. His body was shutting down. Come on, he said to himself. Come on. 3 more miles. He pushed off the tree and kept going. The trail followed the river, which was wide and flat now, flowing gently through a broad valley. The mountains were still there on both sides, but they were further away, and the sky was open and huge above him. After another mile, he smelled something. At first he thought he was imagining it, but then it got stronger. Smoke. Not forest fire smoke, but chimney smoke. The warm, woody smell of a fire burning in a stove somewhere ahead. The smell of civilization. The smell of people. He walked faster. His legs found energy he did not know he had. The trail curved around a hill, and then he saw it. A small cluster of buildings at the edge of the river. A few wooden cabins with metal roofs, a larger building that looked like a community center, a row of parked trucks, and a tall radio tower with a blinking red light on top. Smoke curled from two of the chimneys. A dog barked somewhere. A clothesline with frozen shirts hung between two posts. Denali Station. Arjun tried to shout, but his voice came out as a rough croak. He kept walking, moving down the hill toward the buildings. A man came out of one of the cabins carrying a bucket. He looked up and saw Arjun, a half-frozen man carrying a woman on his back, stumbling down the trail like a ghost. The man dropped the bucket. "Hey, hey, someone get out here. We got people." Doors opened. Faces appeared. Two men ran toward Arjun and reached him just as his legs finally gave out. He fell to his knees in the snow, still holding Sarah on his back. Hands grabbed him, grabbed her, and voices swirled around him. "Get them inside, get blankets, call for a chopper." Everything after that was a blur of warmth and voices and movement. Someone carried him into a cabin and laid him on a bed. Someone wrapped hot blankets around him. Someone put a cup of warm broth in his hands. He drank it, and the warmth spread through his body like sunlight. Through the doorway, he could see people working on Sarah. They had her on a table, and a woman who seemed to know some medicine was looking at her arm and talking into a radio. The words emergency helicopter and possible infection floated through the air. Within 2 hours, a rescue helicopter arrived. The sound of its blades was the most beautiful music Arjun had ever heard. Paramedics rushed in and took Sarah on a stretcher. They checked Arjun too, cleaned his head wound, gave him fluids, wrapped him in thermal blankets. Then they loaded both of them into the helicopter. As the helicopter lifted off the ground, Arjun looked out the window. Below him, the wilderness spread out in all directions. The same endless green and white that had terrified him from the ridge days ago. He could see the river they had crossed, the valley they had walked through, the mountains they had come over. Somewhere out there was the cabin with the message on the wall. Somewhere further was the wreckage of the plane and the body of old Carl. It looked so vast, so impossible. Had they really walked all that way? Sarah was strapped to the stretcher beside him, an IV line in their good arm, an oxygen mask on her face. Her eyes were closed, but her chest was rising and falling steadily. She was alive. They both were. At the hospital in Fairbanks, they treated Sarah's arm with surgery and strong medicine to fight the infection. The doctors said she had been hours away from a very dangerous situation. If they had arrived even half a day later, they might not have been able to save the arm, but they did. She was going to be okay. Arjun spent 3 days in the hospital for exhaustion, mild frostbite on his toes, and the head wound, which needed proper stitches. His mother flew in from his hometown and cried for 20 minutes straight when she saw him. He was not embarrassed about it. On the 4th day in the hospital, Sarah was wheeled into his room in a wheelchair. Her arm was in a proper cast, and she had color in her face again. She looked tired, but alive, truly alive. "The doctors told me you carried me for 5 miles, she said. "It was only 4, Arjun said with a small smile. She shook her head. "You carried me, with no food in you, with your head split open. You put me on your back and walked for hours. Why?" Arjun thought about it. He thought about the man he had been before the crash, the man who was scared of flying, who sat at a desk all day, who played it safe in everything. He thought about the man he had become in 6 days, the man who crossed freezing rivers and built fires and walked through wilderness with another person's life on his shoulders. "Because you would have done the same for me," he said. "And because I found out that I'm not the person I thought I was." Sarah smiled. It was the same smile she had given him in the cabin, warm and real, and full of something that words could not quite capture. Outside the hospital window, snow was falling gently on the streets of Fairbanks. People walked by in warm coats, carrying coffee cups and shopping bags, living their ordinary lives. Arjun watched them and felt something he had never felt before. A deep, quiet gratitude for the simple things. Warm rooms, hot food, a bed, a phone that worked, people nearby. He had gone into the wilderness as one man and come out as another. The mountains and the cold and the hunger had stripped away everything that did not matter, and left only what did: courage, kindness, and the will to keep going when everything said stop. He picked up his phone and called his mother. She answered on the first ring, like she always did. "Hi, Mom," he said. "I'm really okay." And for the first time in a very long time, he meant it. The leather pouch was old. The stitching along its edges had been repaired so many times that the thread was a patchwork of different colors: white, gray, dark blue, black. The buckle was scratched. The leather was soft from years of handling. Yuna opened it the way she always did, with one hand, without looking down, the way a soldier opens a holster. Inside was a curved needle, a spool of fine surgical thread, a tiny pair of scissors no longer than her thumb, 2 antiseptic swabs sealed in foil, and a thin blade in a plastic guard. That was all. It was not a medical kit. It was not a field surgery pack. It was a sewing kit. But in the hands of someone who had spent years closing wounds under bad light in shaking rooms, it was enough. Pill did not see her reach for it. The cub was still staring at the training floor, still sitting straight, still holding her bleeding arm against her chest. Her jaw was tight, and her golden ears were pressed flat against her skull. She was trying very hard not to cry. Among the Ven, crying in a public training space was worse than bleeding. Bleeding showed that you fought. Crying showed that you broke. Yuna did not say anything. She reached over and gently took the cub's arm. Pill flinched. Her whole body went tight, and her ears snapped up, and she turned to look at the human sitting beside her with wide gold eyes. For a moment, she looked ready to pull away. Among the Ven, touch was not gentle. Medicine was fast and hard. Clean the wound, seal it, move on. No one held your arm like this. No one's hands were this warm. Yuna held the arm steady. She did not grip it. She simply cradled it in her left hand, the way you hold something that might break, and turned it so she could see the gash clearly. The cut was long, but not deep. The bluish blood had started to slow. It would heal on its own, probably. But it would heal ugly, and it would hurt for days, and it might scar. She tore open one of the foil packets with her teeth, and pressed the swab against the wound. Pill hissed through her teeth, but did not pull away. The antiseptic was cold. It stung. Yuna cleaned the cut with short, careful strokes, wiping away the blood, clearing the edges of the gash, so she could see what she was working with. When she was done, she set the used swab on the bench beside her, and picked up the needle. Tejo watched from the back row. His hands were still. His datapad sat forgotten on his lap. He could feel the shift in the gallery, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. The Ven adults were watching now. Not all of them. Some were still focused on the drills below. But enough. A Tehran trader 2 rows up had stopped chewing his food. A pair of Ven mothers near the aisle had gone very quiet. A human woman was sewing a Ven cub's wound shut in the front row of a training hall. In public, without being asked, without permission, without rank or authority or any reason that the Ven would recognize. Tejo's hand moved slowly toward his comm unit. He was not sure who he would call. Security, maybe. Or the diplomatic office. Someone who could explain that the human meant no offense, that she did not understand what she was doing, that this was a misunderstanding. But he did not call. He watched. Yuna threaded the needle. She did it fast, without hesitation, the thread passing through the eye on the first try. She pinched the edges of the wound together with her left hand, and pushed the needle through with her right. The first stitch was small and tight, and perfectly placed, then the second, then the third. She sewed the way she breathed, steady, even, without pause. Each stitch was the same size. Each one pulled the skin together cleanly, closing the gash in a neat line that followed the natural grain of the cub's flesh beneath the fur. It was not rough work. It was not quick work. It was careful, patient. The kind of sewing that said, "This matters, and I will not rush it." Pill whimpered once, very quietly, on the fourth stitch. It was a small sound, barely a breath, and Una did not stop. But she did something that she probably did not think about, something that came from a place deeper than thought. She hummed. It was not a song. It had no melody. It was just a low, soft sound in the back of her throat, steady and warm, like the sound a machine makes when it is running well. She had done it 1,000 times before, in field hospitals where the lights flickered and the walls shook, sitting beside soldiers who were too hurt to speak and too scared to be quiet. She would hum, and her hands would move, and the needle would go in and out, and somehow the world would get a little smaller, a little safer, just for a moment. Pill's ears twitched. They moved from pressed flat to half raised, to slowly, flat again, but differently this time. Not fear flat, calm flat, the then sign of ease. Her breathing slowed, her jaw loosened. She was still watching the training floor, but her eyes had gone soft, and Tejo could see that she was not watching the drills anymore. She was just sitting next to someone warm who was making a sound that meant nothing and everything. The stitching took 4 minutes. When Una finished, she tied the thread with a small, precise knot and cut it with the tiny blade. She inspected the work once, turning the cub's arm slightly to check the tension. Then she set the needle down. And then she did something that made Tejo's throat close. She looked down at her own shirt, plain, standard issue, gray logistics uniform, and tore a strip from the hem. The fabric ripped with a sound that was very loud in the quiet gallery. She took the strip and wrapped it around Pill's forearm, covering the stitches, tucking the end under itself so it held firm. A bandage, made from her own clothing, given without a word. Pill stared at her. Una did not stare back. She gave the cub one small nod, just a dip of her head, brief and simple, the kind of nod that says, "You're all right now," without saying anything. And then she put her kit away, closed the leather pouch, and folded her hands in her lap. She looked forward at the training floor. Her face was calm. Her breathing was even. She sat there as if nothing had happened. As if she had not just, in the eyes of every Ven in that gallery, performed one of the most intimate acts their culture recognized. The gallery was silent. Not the silence of an empty room, the silence of a room full of people who do not know what they have just seen. The drills continued on the floor below. Rokai was still shouting. The cubs were still fighting. But up in the gallery, nothing moved. Every Ven was looking at the human woman on the front bench. Some of them had their mouths slightly open. One of the mothers near the aisle had her hand over her own chest, claws curled inward. Tejo's hand was still on his comm unit. He did not press anything. He sat very still and watched Una sit with her hands folded, looking at nothing, calm as stone. The cub was still looking at the human, and there was something on her face that Tejo had never seen on a Ven child before. It took him a moment to recognize it. It was confusion, but not the sharp, angry kind, the soft kind. The kind that comes when something happens that doesn't fit inside any shape you know, and so you just sit with it and let it be strange and warm and new. Pill looked down at the bandage on her arm. She touched it with the claws of her other hand, very gently, running the tips over the fabric. human cloth, torn from the human's own body, wrapped around her wound by hands that were small and warm and impossibly steady. She did not understand what had happened. She was 6 years old, and no one had ever sat next to her like that. But she knew she did not want to move. On the training floor, Rokai finished the grappling rotation and called the cubs to formation. He had not looked up at the gallery. He had not seen what happened. He would hear about it soon enough. Teiho found Yuna in the supply corridor that evening. She was sitting on a crate outside storage room 14, eating a ration bar and reading something on her datapad. Her shirt was still torn at the hem. She had not changed it. She looked up when he approached and gave him a small nod, the same kind she had given the cub. "We need to talk," Teiho said. "All right." He sat down on the crate across from her. The corridor was empty. The lights above them buzzed softly. Somewhere deep in the station, a ventilation fan turned with a low, steady hum. "Do you know what you did today?" he asked. Yuna looked at him. "I stitched a cut." "No," Teiho shook his head. "You didn't just stitch a cut, not to them." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Among the Ven, there's something called Raksu. It means, roughly, the mending that names you. It is the act of physically tending to a cub's wound with your own hands, in a public space, using material from your own body. It is one of the most significant acts in their culture. Only a parent does it, or a pack elder, someone who has authority over the cub, someone who is claiming the cub as their own." Yuna was quiet for a moment. Claiming? Yes. When a Ven adult performs Raksu, they are saying, in front of everyone, "This child is mine to protect. This child belongs to my pack." It is not casual. It is not small. It is a declaration. "I didn't know that." "I know you didn't. That's why I'm telling you." Teiho rubbed his face with both hands. "You sat in the front row of a training hall, took a Ven cub's arm, sewed her wound shut with a hand needle, and bandaged it with cloth torn from your own shirt, in front of a gallery full of Ven adults, during an active training drill, under the command of a senior Fang." Yuna said nothing. Every Ven on that station knows about it by now. Every single one. This is not the kind of thing that stays quiet. "Is she in trouble?" Yuna asked. "The cub?" Teiho blinked. "What? The cub? Is she in trouble because of what I did?" It took him a moment to answer. "No, she's not in trouble. You might be. Rokai is furious." "The instructor?" "Yes. Senior Fang Rokai. He considers what you did an insult. A human, a civilian, a non-combatant, someone with no rank and no standing in the Ven military structure, performed Raksu on one of his cadets, in his training hall, while he was conducting drills. He sees it as an act of interference, an outsider imposing softness on a culture that survives through hardness." Yuna took another bite of her ration bar. She chewed slowly. She swallowed. Then she said, "She was bleeding. She's 6. He waited for more. For an explanation, a justification, a defense, something he could work with, something he could bring to Ronai or Drashan or whoever else was going to demand answers. But Yuna just looked at him with those steady, quiet eyes, and there was nothing else. That was the whole of it. She was bleeding. She's 6. "Yuna," he said carefully, "I understand why you did it. I do. But you need to understand that this is serious. Rokai could file a formal complaint with the station council. He could demand your reassignment. In the worst case, he could invoke a cultural grievance, and that could affect the entire human delegation's standing on this station." "Then he can do that," Yuna said. Teiho opened his mouth, then closed it. He had worked with soldiers before. He had worked with diplomats and politicians, and people who measured every word against its cost. But Yuna was something different. She was not being brave. She was not being stubborn, she was being something else entirely. She simply did not seem to consider the possibility that she had done something wrong. Not because she was ignorant, but because there was something inside her that was older than politics, older than protocol, and it had made a decision that no argument could reach. He left her in the corridor. He did not know what else to say. On his way back to the residential block, Tejo turned a corner and stopped. Drashan was standing in the middle of the corridor. The Ven elder was old. His fur was almost entirely gray, and his eyes had the milky look of someone who had seen more than one lifetime's worth of things. He was shorter than most Ven males. Age had bent his spine slightly, but he carried himself with a kind of weight that had nothing to do with size. He was the station overseer, which meant he watched everything and spoke only when it mattered. He was looking at Tejo. His voice was low and rough, like gravel in a slow river. "Elder Drashan," Tejo replied, and bowed his head slightly. "Can I help you?" "The human who sewed the cub." Tejo's stomach dropped. Yes, I was going to prepare a formal statement. She didn't understand the cultural significance of. Drashan raised one hand. His claws were blunt with age, filed smooth. "I did not ask for a statement." Tejo went quiet. "I ask one question," Drashan said. "The human who sewed the cub, does she have young of her own?" Tejo hesitated. "No, she doesn't." Drashan looked at him. The old Ven's eyes were steady and deep, and for a moment Tejo felt as if he were being examined by something much larger than a single person. As if the entire weight of Ven history was looking through those milky gold eyes and measuring something that it had never measured before. "No young of her own," Drashan repeated, very softly. It was not a question this time. It was something else. A realization, maybe. Or the beginning of one. Then the elder turned and walked away, his claws clicking softly on the metal floor. He did not say goodbye. He did not explain. He simply left, moving down the corridor with the slow, heavy steps of someone carrying a thought too large to speak. Tejo stood alone in the corridor for a long time after that. He replayed the conversation in his head. He thought about Rokai's fury, and Drashan's question, and Yuna sitting on a crate, eating a ration bar with a torn shirt and hands that did not shake. He thought about the cub on the front bench, golden and bleeding, who had not removed the bandage. He did not understand everything. He could not. He was a diplomat, and diplomats lived in the space between things, translating one world to another. But some things did not need translation. Some things sat in a place beneath language, in the part of every species that knew what it looked like when someone simply cared. Tejo went to his quarters. He sat at his desk. He opened a blank report and stared at it for 20 minutes without writing a single word. In her quarters, 3 corridors away, Yuna sat on the edge of her bunk. She had taken the sewing kit out of its pouch and laid everything on the blanket beside her. Needle, thread, scissors, blade, one remaining slob. She picked up the needle and a length of dark thread and began to repair the hem of her shirt. Stitch by stitch, slow and careful, closing the gap she had torn. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. Even in the field hospitals, where the walls shook and the blood was red instead of blue, her hands had never once trembled. People used to ask her how. She never had a good answer. It was not courage. It was not training. It was something simpler than that. Something that lived in her fingers and her breath and the soft hum in her throat. She finished the hem, bit the thread, and tied it off. She held the shirt up to the light and looked at her work. The repair was clean. You could barely see it. She put the shirt down. She put the kit away. She lay back on her bunk and stared at the ceiling, and thought about a golden cub with bright eyes sitting on a bench, trying very hard not to cry. And she thought about a strip of gray cloth wrapped around a small arm, and she thought about the look on the cub's face when she had tied it off and nodded. She did not think about what it meant in Ven culture. She did not think about Rokai or Drashin, or the diplomatic consequences. She thought, I hope it holds. I hope the stitches hold through the night. Then she closed her eyes, and she slept. The assembly was called at first light. Every Ven on the station received the summons, a single tone through the comm system, low and long, the sound that meant a senior Fang was speaking, and all would listen. By the time Teho arrived at Training Hall 9, the gallery was already packed. Ven adults filled every row, sitting with their backs straight and their hands on their knees. Warriors, mothers, engineers, elders. The hall was full, and the hall was quiet. Teho found a spot in the back corner, half hidden behind a support beam. His heart was beating too fast. He had barely slept. He had spent most of the night writing and deleting a diplomatic report, trying to find words that would soften what had happened, words that would protect Yuna and protect the human delegation, and somehow make everything all right. He had not found those words. Yuna was not in the gallery. She had not been summoned. She did not know this was happening. Teho was not sure if that was better or worse. On the training floor below, the junior cadets stood in a single line. 24 cubs, fur of every shade, standing at attention with their arms at their sides. They were young, but they were trained, and they held still the way only Ven children could. Perfectly, without twitching, without breathing too loudly. At the end of the line, shorter than the rest, golden fur catching the overhead lights, Pill stood with her injured arm held straight. The strip of gray cloth was still wrapped around it. She had not removed it. Rokai stood at the center of the floor. He was wearing his ceremonial training plates. Dark metal armor that covered his chest and shoulders, engraved with marks that showed his rank, his kills, his years of service. He wore them only for formal occasions, only when something needed to be said that would be remembered. He looked enormous. He always looked enormous, but today he looked like something carved from rock, something ancient and heavy, that had been standing in that spot since before the station was built. His silver-streaked fur was groomed flat. His gold eyes swept the gallery slowly, touching every face, counting every soul. Then he spoke. He spoke in the Ven tongue, and Teho's translator fed the words into his ear with a slight delay, flat and mechanical, stripping the growl and weight from the sounds. A cub was injured in this hall, Rokai said. This is not unusual. Cubs are injured every day. That is training. That is the way. The cub did not retreat. She walked to the front, and she sat, and she bled where everyone could see. This is also the way. She showed courage. She showed that she was Ven. He paused. The gallery was perfectly still. A human came to her. The word human landed in the hall like a stone dropped into water. Teho could feel the ripple, the slight shift in posture, the tiny movements of ears and claws throughout the gallery. Everyone knew. Everyone had heard. But hearing it from a senior Fang, in formal assembly, was different. The human sat beside the cub. The human took the cub's arm. The human cleaned the wound, and sewed it shut, and wrapped it in cloth torn from her own body. She did this in this hall, in my hall, during my drill, without my permission, without rank, without standing. Rokai's voice was controlled, but Teho could hear the edges of it, the places where the control was holding something back. Not just anger, something more complicated than anger. I have thought about this through the night, Rokai said. I have asked myself what this means. I have asked myself what a senior Fang should do when an outsider enters his hall and performs Roxu on one of his cadets. He turned and looked at the line of cubs. Step forward. The golden cub walked forward. She was limping, as she always did, but her head was up and her eyes were steady. She stopped 3 paces in front of Rokai and stood at attention. She was barely as tall as his waist. The strip of gray cloth around her arm was the brightest thing in the hall. Rokai knelt. The sound that moved through the gallery was not a gasp. The Ven did not gasp. It was something lower, something felt rather than heard. A shift in the air, a vibration in the chest. A senior Fang did not kneel. Not to another warrior, not to an elder, and certainly not to a cub. The knee touched the floor, and every Ven in the gallery felt the weight of it. Rokai reached out and took Pill's arm. Gently, Taeho noticed, more gently than he had expected from those massive hands. He turned the arm and looked at the bandage. He leaned closer and sniffed it. Then he ran a single claw along the edge of the cloth, carefully, and pressed it against the skin beneath. He was feeling the stitches. Through the fur, through the fabric, his claw traced the line of the wound and the thread that held it closed. He was still for a long time. Then he looked at Pill. "Did she speak to you?" Pill shook her head. "Did she ask you to be still?" "No." "Did she tell you it would be all right?" "No." "What did she do?" Pill's voice was small but clear. Every ear in the gallery was turned toward her. "She sat next to me. She sewed. She gave me cloth from herself." Rokai held the cub's arm for another moment. Then he released it, and stood. He rose to his full height, 8 feet of silver and steel, and turned to face the gallery. Taeho pressed his back against the support beam. His mouth was dry. "I have trained warriors for 30 cycles," Rokai said. "I have trained them to bleed and stand. I have trained them to endure. I have taught hundreds of cubs that pain is the teacher, and the body is the lesson, and the only answer to a wound is silence." His voice was different now. The anger was gone. Something else had taken its place, something that Taeho did not have a word for, something that sat between wonder and grief. "But I have never, not once, seen someone walk toward a bleeding cub with no orders, no rank, no obligation, no bond of blood or pack or duty. She was not commanded to go. She was not asked. She was not even supposed to be there. She is a supply worker. She counts boxes." A pause that lasted a lifetime. And she walked to the front row, and she sat down, and she sewed. Rokai's claws opened and closed at his sides. She did not comfort the cub. She did not speak soft words. She treated the wound the way a warrior treats a weapon, with care and skill and attention. She treated the cub as something worth repairing. He looked across the rows of faces. Gold eyes meeting gold eyes. That is not softness. I have thought about it through the night, and I have turned it over in my mind, and I will tell you now, before all of you, that what the human did is not softness. His voice dropped low. It is something I do not have a word for. In 30 cycles of service, I have not learned a word for it. But I saw it, and it was real, and I will not pretend that I did not see it. He turned to one of the junior cadets. "Bring the human, the woman from the supply division. Bring her here." The cadet saluted and ran. Taeho closed his eyes. His heart was hammering. He did not know what was coming next. He did not know if this was going to end well or badly, or somewhere in between. He only knew that the look on Rokai's face was not the face of a man about to punish someone. It was the face of a man who had discovered something that did not fit inside any shape he knew, and was brave enough to say so. Yuna came through the side entrance of Training Hall 9, walking behind a young Ven cadet who kept glancing back at her as if she might disappear. She was wearing the same gray logistics uniform with the repaired hem. The sewing kit was on her belt. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was calm. She stepped onto the training floor and stopped. The hall was full. She could see that immediately. Every seat in the gallery was taken, rows and rows of Ven watching her from above, their gold eyes steady and unblinking. On the floor, 24 cubs stood in formation, still as stone, and at the center of everything, Rokai stood in his ceremonial plates, enormous and silent, looking directly at her. Yuna was the only human in the hall. She did not look at the gallery. She did not look at Taeho, who was pressed against a support beam in the back corner with his hands clenched. Then she looked at Pill, standing at the end of the cadet line, golden and small, the gray bandage still on her arm. She walked to the center of the floor. Her boots made soft sounds on the metal. In the silence of the hall, every step was clear. She stopped at a distance she felt was right, not too close, not too far, and stood with her hands at her sides. Rokai looked down at her. The size difference was almost absurd. He was 8 feet of muscle and fur and ceremonial armor. She was a small woman in a gray shirt with a sewing kit on her belt. She barely reached his chest. But she stood the way she always stood, straight, quiet, with her weight settled evenly on both feet, like someone who had learned a long time ago that you do not need to be large to be steady. Rokai took 3 steps forward, then he stopped. 3 paces, the Venn distance of formal respect. It was the distance maintained when addressing an elder or a pack leader, someone whose authority was recognized, someone who had earned the right to be approached with care. It was not the distance you kept from a stranger. It was not the distance you kept from a subordinate. In the gallery, several Venn adults leaned forward. The 3-pace distance had not been lost on them. Rokai spoke, but he did not speak in the Venn tongue. He spoke in human common, accented, rough, each word placed carefully, like a stone being laid in a wall. The translator in Taeho's ear went silent. It had nothing to translate. Rokai was speaking Yuna's language. No one in the hall had ever heard him do this before. "You mended my cadet," Rokai said. Yuna met his eyes. She did not tilt her head back to do it, though she should have had to. She simply looked at him, and the angle did not seem to matter. "I did," she said. "You used your own cloth?" "I did." "Why?" The word echoed in the hall. It was the only question that mattered. Every Venn in the gallery was listening. Every cub on the floor was listening. Droshan, standing somewhere in the shadows of the upper level, was listening. Taeho was listening so hard he forgot to breathe. Yuna was quiet for a moment, not because she did not know the answer, but because she was choosing how to say it, the way she chose where to place a stitch, with care, with purpose, with an understanding that some things, once said, stay. Because she walked to the front row, Yuna said. Her voice was not loud. She did not try to fill the hall with it. She simply spoke, and the hall leaned in to hear. She didn't go to the back. She didn't hide. She sat where everyone could see her bleed. She paused. That kind of brave shouldn't have to sit alone. The words hung in the air. They were simple words, small words, the kind of words a child could understand. And maybe that was why they landed so hard, because there was no argument in them, no philosophy, no grand speech about the nature of compassion or the duties of the strong toward the weak. Just a fact, stated plainly by a woman who believed it the way she believed in gravity. Rokai stared at her. The hall waited. Taeho pressed his back against the beam and felt something building in his chest. Not fear anymore, not worry, but something warm and tight that he could not name. He watched Rokai's face and saw the moment it changed. It was not sudden. It was not dramatic. It was a slow thing, like ice melting, like a door opening that had been closed for a very long time. The hard lines around the instructor's eyes softened. His jaw, which had been set like iron, loosened by a fraction. His shoulders, which had been squared for battle, settled. He was a senior Fang. He had built his life on discipline and control, and the belief that strength was the answer to everything. But he was standing 3 paces from a small human woman who had just told him, in his own hall, in front of his entire world, that courage deserves company, and he did not have a wall strong enough for that. Rokai raised his right hand. He closed it into a fist. He turned the fist inward, claws against his own chest, pressing over his heart. Then he lowered his head. the salute of acknowledged authority, given by a senior Fang to a human civilian in a formal assembly before every Ven on the station. And he said one word, "Ma'am." The word was human. The gesture was Ven. Together, they were something that had never existed before. A bridge built in a single moment between two species that had never understood each other. Held together, not by treaties or trade agreements or shared enemies, but by a strip of torn cloth on a child's arm. The silence that followed was the deepest Taeho had ever heard. Then, behind Rokai's small movement, Pill stepped out of the cadet line. She raised her small fist, claws turned inward against her chest, and dipped her golden head. The bandage on her arm caught the light. Then the cub next to her did the same, then the next, one by one, down the entire line. 24 cubs raised their fists and lowered their heads. Some of them were shaking slightly. Some of them did not fully understand what they were doing. But they did it, because Pill did it, and because the thing they had just heard was true in a way that did not need explaining. In the gallery, a Ven mother raised her fist, then another, then an old warrior with scars on his arms, then a young engineer who had never seen combat. The salute spread through the rows like a wave, silent and steady, and Taeho watched it move and felt the warm, tight thing in his chest break open, and he had to press his hand over his mouth, because he was a diplomat, and diplomats did not cry in public. Yuna stood on the training floor and looked at the hall, full of raised fists and bowed heads. She did not raise her own fist. She did not bow. She stood still, and something moved across her face, just for a moment, just a flash, that might have been surprise, or might have been something deeper that she would never tell anyone about. Then she nodded, the same small nod, the same one she had given the cub on the bench. She turned, and she walked out of the hall. Her boots were soft on the metal floor. The side door opened and closed behind her, and she was gone. The hall stayed silent for a long time after that. In the upper gallery, deep in the shadows where no one could see him, Drashin stood with his arms folded across his old chest. His milky gold eyes were fixed on the door through which the human had left. He stood there for a while, not moving, not speaking, letting the weight of what he had just witnessed settle into his bones. Then he said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "Now I understand why the galaxy is afraid of them." He paused. A slow breath. It was never their warships. Below, on the training floor, Rokai straightened. He dropped his fist. He looked at his cadets. And for the first time in 30 cycles, he did not shout. He spoke to them softly, almost gently, and he said, "Back to drills." The cubs moved. Training resumed. The hall filled with sound again, the familiar noise of young bodies hitting the floor and getting back up. But something had changed. In the weeks that followed, Pill sat in the front row of every drill, even the ones she could not finish, even the ones where she fell and fell again. She sat in the front, with her back straight and her eyes forward, and she did not sit alone. Sometimes another cub sat with her, sometimes two. She did not remove the bandage until the wound fully healed. When she did, she folded the strip of gray cloth into a small, neat square, and tucked it inside her cadet armor, over her heart. She kept it there for years, long after the scar faded, long after she grew tall enough to look a human in the eye. And Yuna never mentioned it again. She went back to her supply closet, and her forms, and her crates. She counted bandage boxes. She repaired torn uniforms. She carried her sewing kit on her belt, and she hummed when she worked, that same low, tuneless sound. And if anyone asked her about the day in Training Hall 9, she would look at them with those steady, quiet eyes and change the subject. She did not need to talk about it. "Some things are sewn too deep," to come undone.